My name is John Lustria. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Savannah Williamson. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're thrilled to have you here today. We're going to be discussing her research into medical care within enslaved communities and really focus on the medical experience of African Americans during the Civil War era writ large. So I think we're going to have a really engaging discussion today. I know I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you all enjoy it as well. But before we begin, of course, I always want to say, again, first, thank you for watching, and make sure you tune in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, things of that nature. It's always great to hear where people are tuning in from. And then, of course, if you want to support the museum and the work we do, an easy way to do that for free is to hit the like button on this video. Share it with your friends, hit the share button. It's easy, it's free, and it helps us out quite a bit. So go ahead and do that if you enjoy this video or any of the content that we produce. And the best way to stay up to date with all of that is by following us on Facebook, on Instagram, following us on YouTube, wherever you get your social medias, we're out there. So that's an easy, free way you can support us. And if you want to take your support to the next level, our fundraising campaign that we're working on right now, we're raising money to buy 2 letters written by Clara Barton shortly after the Civil War, talking about her work with the Missing Soldiers Office, which is a very key aspect of our mission and what we do. So we're working on raising money to help buy those letters and expand our collection and be able to preserve those letters that talk about that incredible work for future generations. So I'll post a link for to help support us in that way in the comments here shortly. But those are a few ways that you can support us. And if you can, I'd really appreciate it. But for now, let's go ahead and get started here. Savannah, I wonder if maybe you could get us started, introduce yourself to our audience, and tell us sort of how you came to be where you are now and what drew you to the field of 19th century / medical history.
Right, absolutely. Well, thank you again, John, for inviting me to participate in this live stream. I'm really excited. I'm Dr. Savannah Williamson. I'm an assistant professor of history at Sul Ross State University, which is located in the high desert mountains of the Rio Grande Valley and the Big Bend, near Big Bend National Park. It's a pretty beautiful area. And I'm fortunate enough to have taught in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences for the last 5 years. And for the past 2 years, I have also served as the inaugural coordinator for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the 4 Sul Ross campuses located throughout the Rio Grande Valley. So I'm way out in the desert mountains of West Texas, kind of a remote, isolated area. We're one of the few counties still listed by the census as frontier, which is a lot of fun, and adds a whole new kind of layer to the experience out here, and also forces me to be a little more creative when it comes to trying to bring history to life in the classroom. So I guess that's a little about where I am. I entered 19th century history when I changed my major to history my sophomore or junior year of undergrad. I was actually pre-med for a few years, so I have like organic chemistry as an elective on my transcripts now, which just makes me seem a whole other level of nerdy or crazy. Not that they're mutually exclusive. So I was pre-med and really realized that I missed people and that I enjoyed stories. And so I changed my major to history and also studied communications and classical studies. And I realized I really enjoyed teaching. So when I got to graduate school, I had planned to pursue study in the fields of 19th century history, slavery studies, but specifically looking at the politics and the legal history of slavery. But very quickly realized my passion, or was reminded of my passion and interest in medicine. The history department at the University of Houston, where I did my master's and doctoral work, had just hired a medical historian. So once I took a class with him, I was pretty hooked, and it made me realize that I could apply my previous background of school, kind of what scientific knowledge I had, but also it was kind of a way to bring really big, complex subjects and ideas in history into a more relatable arena when it comes to talking to my students. So not every student may be able to relate to a wartime experience or to a founding father, or feel comfortable discussing economic theory, but everybody knows what it's like to be sick or to worry about a loved one. And so I realized that medical history was a great way to approach really big, complicated topics in a way that makes them seem more personable and relatable. And so that's been a lot of fun in the classroom as well. So I've really gotten a lot of opportunities to kind of have fun and jump around in a lot of different areas in my education and my also career.
Yeah, that's a really interesting journey, and that's why I love asking folks that question, because it's the avenues to the study of history, and especially I think medical history, are as varied as the people doing it. So that's really interesting. I forgot to mention at the top here, if folks have questions as we go along, please do chime in. We'll get to as many of them as we can. We got a number of folks tuning in: Diane from New Jersey, Barbara, one of our faithful viewers, Fernando from Venezuela. It's good to see Sharita tuning in again. Lindsay from watching from Lake Jackson, Texas. Go UH. Which I thought you'd appreciate.
There you go. Yeah, go Cougs.
That's right, go Cougs, and a number of other folks tuning in throughout the country. So, in your research, talking about the African American medical experience, certainly when doing any sort of research on the African American experience, it can be challenging to find sources, but certainly it's not a prohibitive challenge. And for anyone that is interested in that, I think it'd be instructive, just maybe if you could tell us, where you looked for sources as you were doing your research, and if while you were doing this, there were any areas where you found sources that maybe surprised you, that were unexpected.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, of course, one of the greatest resources for those studying the experiences of enslaved people are the WPA ex-slave interviews, which are, many historians have noted and commented and published on the questionable reliability of those sources due to the nature in which they were conducted. But at the same time, they bring a lot of valuable information and insight into the daily lives and experiences of formerly enslaved peoples, and so that's a great starting point, because of course, if you want to find out the answer to the question, go to the source, right? That's the first place you should go. So those, of course, are incredibly helpful resources and are published in series and supplemental series on a state-by-state basis, thousands of interviews. Some of them were actually recorded, so you can actually hear the audio, which is also incredibly powerful. But yeah, otherwise it's difficult to figure out how to try to tell a story and do justice to those you're, trying to highlight when their stories have been intentionally left out, or they've been prevented from being able to tell it in a lot of different ways. So I've always said that studying and researching in this field is like looking for an unknown number of needles in an unknown number of haystacks. And so you kind of, you may go into an archive or a library or special collections, or a database, or government records buildings, and think that you're going to find something, and you may not, or you may have no idea what you'll find, but you think there might be something useful, and you just kind of have to go through all of it and see what you can find. So a lot of the materials that I look at include the journals and diaries and ledgers of slaveholders and slave traders, those who ran slave auction yards and pens, account books of slave trading firms and their personal and professional correspondence, personal and private, and also business letters and correspondence. I look at doctor's notes and case journals and even the receipts in their records, medical journals, published case studies, almanacs, hospital records, newspaper advertisements, legal case briefs, government records, at-home medical guides and care kits, military census data, insurance claims, memoirs and autobiographies of formerly enslaved people. There's really no stone that I will pass by without trying to turn it over and see if there's something there. Because, you know, when you don't have as many of the traditional sources, you kind of have to think of each piece as a separate, you know, part of the puzzle, right? And so you just have to figure out where the puzzle pieces are, and they may not look like you thought they would, and hopefully you can put them together and see the big picture of what the medical and health experiences of enslaved people were like, and also just how concepts of health and race and bodies really influence nearly every part of American society and day-to-day life in the antebellum period. So yeah, I look at a lot of different sources just because I kind of have to. The ones that have stuck out to me or surprised me, one that was, I think, significant to me in my experience and my education that helped me realize that I wanted to study slavery was an interview, one of the ex-slave interviews from the WPA of a man in Arkansas who was a pretty unfortunate story and just really upsetting that he and another enslaved woman on the plantation where they were fell in love and got married in secret. And of course, when their owner found out, he was not happy because it disrupted the pairing that he had tried to set up to make sure that certain slaves were reproducing with one another. And so he tried to split them up. That didn't work. They continued to meet at night in secret. He sold the wife away to another plantation. Again, they kept meeting in secret. And then when the owner found out that they were sneaking away at night and still meeting up, he bought the woman back only specifically for the purpose of forcing her husband to watch her be tortured and killed. And so it's not a very, you know, positive story, but it was one of those stories that stuck with me so much that I literally put the book in the freezer for 3 days, which I'd never done, but it affected me a lot. And it really made me realize that there were so many more layers to this, you know, this history that I hadn't known or even thought about. So that's really one that surprises me, or that stuck out to me a lot. And I kind of say that since then, I find a lot of the sources shocking, but not surprising after that one, because it's hard to kind of be surprised after something like that. But the other one that really sticks out to me is an advertisement placed in the Charleston Mercury in the antebellum period. It was an advertisement in a local newspaper placed by a doctor who was looking to buy sick and chronically ill, disabled slaves for the purpose of medical experimentation, hoping to find a cure that he could profit off of, and then also to sell them, for profit after curing or healing them. And it always kind of makes me wonder. I often will talk about that advertisement, the case, and the language that's used in some of my first year classes. But I wonder what happened to those people. I wonder how many slaveholders answered those advertisements and sold their slaves to Dr. Skinner on King Street. Was it King Street or Church Street in Charleston? One of the two. I think it's Church Street, because last I checked before the pandemic, that building, that address where his office was located, where his practice was, is or has been a like high-end antique furniture dealer. And so it's, whenever I'm in Charleston, I kind of walk by that place sometimes and just think, man, if those walls could talk, and what kind of stories and, what kind of people, who walked in, who walked out. I always think it's really interesting. It makes you think about kind of the long shadow of slavery that still kind of is cast over us all the time, and we don't realize it. So those are some of the cases that stick out to me. But there's also, entire medical books just on, case studies of what doctors pulled out of random orifices in the 1800s. I think that's also fascinating and great, because some of the doctors are pretty funny.
There's no doubt about that. Yeah, for all the grim, grisly, and dark things of 19th century medical history, and there are many, there are sometimes just as many kind of goofy and weird things to come out of it as well.
Yep. Yeah. Some of my favorite include notes of doctors like in the 1830s or 40s saying, "I don't think she actually fell on that bottle," kind of a just thing. And it's like, wait, it's, it's nice to know that they had a sense of humor about it.
Exactly. Well, I love that line, searching for an unknown number of needles in an unknown number of haystacks. That's a great one. And really, I think and that's maybe the most thorough answer I've ever had to that question about sources. I mean, you really thought pretty broadly about it, and what it reveals is that, and not just with this subject, but really when researching anything, persistence is really the name of the game, because there's just so much out there just waiting to be found. Just needs a sort of a clever enough person to know where to look for it, basically.
Clever, stubborn, persistent.
Yeah, there's a very thin line between the two, clever and stubborn there. So as we start to get into this, certainly medical care, for enslaved folks, it's a tricky proposition, certainly for someone trying to construct a narrative out of this, because we have a number of parties involved here. Of course, you have the slave holders, the slave traders, white physicians, medical care being done within the enslaved community by African Americans for African Americans. There's a lot of moving parts to this. Can you maybe kind of speak to what those dynamics could look like sometimes? I know that's kind of starting broad, but just take that where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. There are a lot of moving parts. And unfortunately, that also means that there's not necessarily like one standard answer, right? Because the experiences that people had in slavery when it comes to health and medical care is going to vary drastically depending on time, place, and also just their own personal experience and their own identities. And so one of the things I think is important to kind of emphasize at this point in time is that when it comes to medical care of enslaved people in the agricultural and industrial South, that care is coming from how I've broken it down into three groups of influence, right? And so what I've done is taken the term triality, which is an astrophysics term about bodies in space and forces of influence working to affect those bodies. It's actually a term that was published first in an edited volume by Stephen Hawking in 1981. So it's fun to be able to bring some Stephen Hawking into slavery studies. But yeah, the trialities. So the idea that that medicine and healthcare are actually coming from three different groups of influence, from slaveholders and traders, from white physicians, and from the enslaved communities themselves. And each of these groups is actually trying to influence and affect the bodies and the health and well-being of enslaved people to their own end and towards their own end goals. And those goals may not be the same, and the methods of achieving those goals is often not the same. And so you've got slaveholders and slave traders who are going to be approaching medical and healthcare from the perspective of a cost-benefit analysis, right? They're going to consider the value of an enslaved person, the cost of treatment or care, and whether it's financially worth their investment to actually take the time and effort and finances to pursue that medical care or treatment. And so although there were slaveholders who did genuinely care about the well-being of their slaves, a majority of slaveholders are going to determine whether to give care and what kind of care and how much care based on their own calculus of profit. And so it really kind of depends on the perceived value of the enslaved peoples who are sick or injured in terms of whether or not a slaveholder or trader may actually invest in health or medical care. They may only invest enough. Typically, they will only invest enough to make sure that that slave is sound or, is able to work without labor and labor production being interfered with. And then, of course, you're going to have physicians who are interested in medicine from a knowledge perspective. So they want to acquire more understanding about the body, particularly Black bodies, so that they could claim themselves experts in Black bodies or peculiarities to create a niche for themselves within the medical marketplace at the time, because without any standardization, any set requirements, there are no, state licensing requirements or accreditation. So there are a lot of medical providers in the marketplace. So to create a niche for themselves, they want to study Black bodies so that they can, basically market themselves as experts in slave bodies to slaveholders and the slaveholding class. And of course, that also doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be looking out for the best interest of those people overall, since their main objective is profit and knowledge, and of course the political and socioeconomic status that would come with those things. And then finally, from enslaved communities, you have practices that often have to take place at night or in secrecy away from the view of slaveholders, because slaveholders often saw medical care as a form of power over slaves' bodies. And so for slaves to reclaim that power and authority would be a threat to the slavery institution and the slave power. And so a lot of slaveholders were very concerned about medical care for and by enslaved healers because they thought it was subversive. And so a lot of this had to take place in secret and at night. And these members of the community who practiced medicine tended to be midwives or shamans or herbalists. And a lot of that knowledge was passed down from generation to generation orally from before transatlantic migration. And so a lot of those practices tend to use more herbal, homeopathic, more natural, less intense, less invasive treatments than the formally trained or practicing physician who may use more heroic medicines, which include things like, bleeding, cupping, purging, blistering, and pretty harsh pharmacopoeia. And then, of course, the quality of care from slaveholders is going to vary drastically depending on how much value they see those people as having. So really the experience can vary quite a bit. So I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question very specifically, but yeah, there's a lot of moving parts. And so it can make for a unique experience and a complicated situation if a person is sick or injured and they are not seen by white slaveholding members as having value or being worth healing, but also trying to navigate procuring care from within your own community and worrying about being caught, potential punishment of that. So yeah, there's a lot that can go into it. It's not as simple as we would like to think, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job there of, kind of explaining who the relevant parties were in this equation and, how, to further the math analogy, what some of the variables might be there and, what these people are looking for. And so no, I think you you painted a pretty good picture there. I wonder if maybe if we can zoom in perhaps a touch more, get a little specific, so let's say an enslaved person is sick, and what would that experience be like? And of course, I guess it depends on what they're sick with, of course, but what that dynamic, how that might differ, whether it's on a plantation setting where there are many other enslaved folks there, or perhaps on a small farm where it's just one, or there's maybe only two or three. Do you have any examples you might be able to give us?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, just kind of going back, emphasizing that really whether or not slaveholders invested in medical care was based on perceptions of value, and a lot of this language that was used in sales and advertisements really revolved around ideas about the body and about health and about soundness and how profitable an enslaved person's body could potentially be to a slaveholder. And so a lot of times you would see what's referred to as prime field hands, young men who were of kind of peak health and fitness. They were considered to have the most value in slave society, or be the most valuable for the most part, in addition to birthing aged women. So a prime field hand, for example, may sell or maybe evaluated on the market for sale at around $900 if they're completely healthy. And that's if they're about 20 years old. If they're 40 years old and completely healthy, that number drops to just under $400. If they are 50 and completely healthy, they are evaluated at $150 or less. And then if they're 60 and completely healthy, it's only $50. So you can kind of see how age and perception of ability and profitability really can go into the calculus of perceived value. And that's really going to have an impact on the extent to which slaveholders and traders are going to provide medical care. And so when we think about the cost of medical care, a lot of slaveholders are going to look to treat slaves themselves, or to wait to call a doctor, if at all possible, to save on operational costs. And so most small farms and smaller plantations tended to have at-home medical guides and medical manuals for basically DIY medical care at home, which in my mind, I always just imagine like those, at-home medicine for dummies or something like that, just seems like a bad idea. But of course, if you're on a small farm and can't afford to call a physician, or if you're in a area that's more remote and isolated and harder for a doctor to come out, or if you live in a city and it's just easier to send an enslaved person to a local city hospital, then that's what you can do. But most of the time, they're going to try to stave off calling the doctor if they can, and provide at-home care. And these at-home medical kits were written by trained physicians and designed as a guide for lay people to treat injury and illness in the absence of a trained medical professional. And so a lot of these at-home medical guides give instructions for pretty harsh and often dangerous treatments. Most of the medical guides include instructions for blistering, bloodletting, measuring and administering purgatives, stimulants, depressants. Medicine chests were stocked with things like calomel, opium, castor oil, ipecac, laudanum, quinine. They maintained supplies of lancets and blister powders and cupping equipment. And so a lot of these treatments tended to tax the body and really depleted a lot of enslaved people who were already sick. So if you can imagine, when you're sick and have a fever and your immune system's weakened, you're trying to fight it off, and someone comes in and says, we're going to bleed you and make you throw up a lot. It's not really going to help, most likely. If it's bad enough that a doctor would call a physician, then physicians are going to do a lot of that same care. It may be a little more extreme with heroics. They may be a little more willing to bleed or blister or cup to sweat them, to associate or attribute illness to miasma or, violent emotions or extreme heat or cold and things like that. So there's a lot of pretty extreme, harsh treatments. I know several doctors who I've studied out of places like Louisiana, Alabama, it wasn't uncommon for them to like dig a hole and put a fire pit in it and then have a sick person jump down in there, cover them with blankets, give them a bunch of purgatives, and then have them sweat and do this days and days on ends to try to cure them from whatever fever or illness they may have. So pretty harsh treatments. A plantation that is large enough to have its own infirmary or hospital or sick house, you may get care from a physician, but a lot of times you'll also receive care from members of the enslaved community, whether that's older women or men or people with disabilities. Sometimes you've even got 4-year-olds who are in charge of those facilities and in charge of looking after all the babies and sick people, which is also terrifying. And so that's going to be a challenge as well. And then, of course, in order to stave off expenses, some slaveholders end up denying care altogether or providing very limited care. They may decide to sell sick or chronically ill or disabled enslaved people, sell them off to reduce their overhead costs or cost of operation to prevent loss on investment. And then they also may admit enslaved people to local hospitals for medical experimentation, which they also saw as kind of a win-win, because if the experimentation and the treatment works, then they can continue to profit off of that enslaved person's body and also their value as property. If it doesn't, then they are not charged for the cost of the medical care by the school. And then, of course, another option would be just to sell them to science for experimentation. And then finally, the other option that a lot of slaveholders actually took advantage of until it was illegal in all slaveholding states by the 1830s was to manumit their elderly and disabled and chronically ill slaves. So they would free them, but basically just release them into the wild without any resources or money or support system, any ways to support themselves or take care of themselves. So really they were freed, but it was only to save money on behalf of the slaveholder. And so by 1830, this is such a problem that every slaveholding state has passed a law prohibiting manumission because so many slaveholders were just releasing sick and disabled and elderly slaves into the wild. And they were starting to form very large like refugee societies, basically. So there's a lot of different experiences with that. And then, of course, from enslaved people, the care is going to be much less harsh, much more herbal, mild, and also a lot more trusted than a white provider. So, for example, for something like a fever, you may have a slaveholder decide that they're going to give you a bunch of ipecac and some morphine and some opium, and they're going to make you sweat and blister, right? And if that doesn't work, then we're going to call in the doctor eventually, and they're going to bleed and purge you and give you more harsh medications. Whereas from the enslaved community, they're going to make you an asafoetida necklace with turpentine around it to stave off disease, which is asafoetida actually and turpentine function as antiseptics and antibacterials. And so they're effective in staving off disease, and it's also helpful in clearing up your sinuses and your nasal passage. It's kind of like a Vicks vapor rub, basically, tying asafoetida and turpentine around your neck. So, but if you got sick with the flu, then you could expect things like, cedar and chamomile and lavender teas, and a lot more fluids and rest in your diet, as opposed to something really harsh, like you would see from white providers, whether they be slaveholders or doctors. So there's going to be a lot of tension, I think, over that, because of course people are going to want to, look out for themselves and their community in their best interest, but their interests are not necessarily aligned with slaveholders or doctors' interests. And so that can create a lot of tension. Another example would be something like infant weaning or childbirth complications, right? So infant weaning for enslaved communities, people wanted to wean for 1.5 to 2 years. Physicians recommended about a year, maybe 1.5 years on some of the more extreme ends. But slaveholders, of course, don't want to lose out on potential profits of the labor of enslaved women. So they try to get them back to the fields and to work as soon as possible. And so for slaveholders, they only want, weaning to happen occasionally, 3 or 4 times a day for about 6-8 months, maybe, and that's it. And so, of course, you're going to see a lot of tension with trying to navigate those dynamics. And making it more complicated is the fact that slaveholders often withheld food and supplies from enslaved families when they had a child until that child was of an age that they could start contributing to plantation revenue. So oftentimes they wouldn't get extra blankets or food, even though they had an extra mouth to feed. And so it was kind of a way to incentivize that labor sooner, but also it's going to contribute to a lot of long-lasting health problems among enslaved populations, because, again, you're not necessarily looking out for the health and well-being of enslaved populations. So, but yeah, there's a lot of examples of all kinds of different types of care and conflicts between doctors and physicians and slaveholding class. Another thing I thought was really funny is doctors tended to lament in their notes and their records about, they expressed a sense of frustration that slaveholders would wait too long to call them, and that they really didn't like having, high mortality rates on their record, because if the slaveholder had called them sooner and not worried so much about the cost of care, they could have actually provided better treatment. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle, I think, for sure.
Yeah, definitely interesting and very contested sort of battleground that doesn't get a lot of, not a lot of attention paid to it in tellings of the period.
Mm.
I want to pop over to the comments. We have a number of, I think, really interesting questions over here. Getting us started from Barbara. Did enslaved people have any methods of taking care of their teeth? Was brushing common back then? Can you speak to anything about dental care?
Dental care. Dental care is kind of a hot topic that makes people cringe sometimes, I think, today. But when you think about 19th century, 18th century practices, it's even more cringy.
Well, and I'll note we have a saying at the museum, Civil War medicine, it's not what you think. But we have another saying at the museum, Civil War dentistry, it's exactly what you think. It's not very good.
Yeah, it's really not.
Carry on.
It's really not. So things like brushing with, pine needles or things like that were not uncommon. But yeah, dental care, of course, is going to be difficult, especially when you don't have a very healthy or balanced diet. And of course, hygiene wasn't a thing in the 19th century. We don't get germ theory for a couple more decades. And so another complication that adds to the dental care of enslaved people is a lot of slaveholders would take their slaves' teeth if they had good teeth. And they would use them for themselves. They would try to transplant them directly into their own mouths at the root a few times. George Washington was really famous for doing this. He of course had bad teeth and wore dentures. And of course we all know the ivory denture kind of thing. But his first few sets of dentures were actually made from the teeth of his slaves. He brought a doctor onto the plantation and chose the slaves with some of the best teeth and forced them to give up their teeth against their will. As far as I can tell, in most cases, I can't imagine, and many people would volunteer to have their teeth pulled for no reason. So yeah, he tried several times to directly implant their teeth at the root into his mouth, and when that didn't work, he had a few sets of dentures made from the teeth of his slaves. And so it wasn't uncommon for that to happen. And also you would see grave robbing. People would take teeth from the dead and sell them to people to make dentures or to try to implant. So yeah, dental care is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, you do have some dental care, right? Brushing with pine needles and things like that. But of course, without adequate knowledge of hygiene, but also the precarious position of being held in bondage means that you don't really have a say as much in your own self-care. So those things would have been something that they would have to do again on their own.
Yikes! Some of that stuff about the dentures, that's pretty intense, and certainly gross and certainly not right. But especially the grave robbing stuff. We talk a lot about grave robbing at the museum because it's, sort of a morbidly interesting thing that we get to talk about. But that I did not know, that people would dig up bodies and sell teeth, like basically for dentures. Whew, that's something else.
Yeah, it's it makes me appreciate that we live in the 21st century all the more with modern medicine and technology.
Absolutely. Another question here in the comments, this one from Anna. Were there any especially groundbreaking medical discoveries that we benefit from today made by doctors treating the enslaved communities? And something that certainly comes to mind is, Jim Downs' recent book, Maladies of Empire, about, a lot of these kind of discoveries, particularly in epidemiology, that the kind of unsung heroes were the marginalized communities who were sort of experimented on mostly against their will. And then of course you have someone like Dr. Sims that comes to mind, the father of gynecology and things of that nature. But that's what rushes to mind for me, and I wondered if you had anything else that comes to mind for you.
Yeah, I mean, those are definitely some of the ones that come to mind, like as the most obvious, right? So Dr. J Marion Sims out of he eventually moved to New York and founds the first one of the first public women's hospitals in the country in New York. But before that, he made a name for himself, becoming an expert in quote unquote Negro peculiarities, and his main area of study that he wanted to cure and find a cure for was vesicovaginal fistula, which was an incredibly painful and debilitating and really common condition that can result after childbirth. And so he famously experiments over 30 times on 5 enslaved women, does not sedate or anesthetize them because at the time they believed that more melanated people didn't experience pain or experience pain to a far lesser degree. So they didn't think they needed to do that. So he performed, multiple surgeries while his patients were still fully conscious and could feel everything. And part of that was he wanted them to comment and give feedback during the surgeries. So he would know if he was on the right track in some cases. But of course, that technique for vesicovaginal fistula is still what we use. The speculum and a lot of gynecological tools and instruments that are still used pretty much were developed. Many of those were developed by Sims and really haven't changed at all. When we're looking at things like, the smallpox vaccine was developed by with the help of a enslaved man at the time. So we've got a lot of techniques and procedures that are developed by experimenting on enslaved people against their will. And so there's that. And of course, a lot of just epidemiological knowledge, like you were saying, with Jim Downs' work, and of course people like Deirdre Cooper Owens and Gretchen Long and Dia Boster and Charlotte Fett. They all have great work on the different ways in which enslaved people and Black people and people of color more generally have been objectified, and that a lot of the medical and scientific community has kind of been apologetic and seen it as a bit of a means to an end. But there's quite a bit. We have, of course, the first open heart surgeries are developed with the help of formerly enslaved men in hospitals. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it. And of course, there's going to be the unsung stories of enslaved healers and midwives and assistants who were really the ones who taught and trained the white doctors, but functioned as their assistants, and so therefore didn't get as much credit. And we still don't know the names of all of Sims's subjects that he experimented on, the 5 women, but we know some of their names. So we're still finding out about a lot of that. But of course, yeah, Sims is probably one of the biggest ones that comes to mind.
Yeah, and just in case folks didn't catch, you mentioned a lot of names. Something of people doing research on that subject, for people that maybe joined late. These will continue to exist on our Facebook page and eventually the YouTube channel, so you can go back and rewind and play that again. But just to underscore 2 books that I've read that are I think really excellent: Jim Downs' Maladies of Empire and Deirdre Cooper Owens' Medical Bondage, touch on some of those subjects that we were just covering. So shout
out to Dee Dee, who's sick with COVID right now. So
absolutely.
Hope you feel better, Dr. Allen.
A question from Miriam here. This I think is a really interesting one. Did enslaved women practice herbal abortions, and would this risk severe punishment?
Yes. The answer to both questions is yes, absolutely. And so that's something that is going to be not the most common. Much more common were different forms of contraception that were passed down through oral tradition. But of course, that was used to prevent pregnancy, or to give more time between pregnancies, to allow more time for weaning, or just if someone didn't want to have children. But abortifacients were, of course, not known of, and that information had been passed down from women through the generations. The most common, ironically, is actually the root of the cotton plant. So if you boil the root of the cotton plant into a tea, it functions as an abortifacient, and so it will induce menstruation, and which will ultimately, most of the time, ideally, ensure that fertilization doesn't occur, right? So preventing pregnancy, or to induce a miscarriage or an abortion through the use of cotton plant tea. And of course, this had to be done in secret and hide all the evidence. And this was something that slaveholders were so worried about happening, because they were so convinced that slave women, particularly midwives and healers, were a threat to them, that they were, practicing abortions or infanticide all the time to try to undermine slaveholders and their wealth and their property holdings and all those things. It was, as far as we can tell from records, it is not nearly as common as slaveholders believed or said it was. But we do know that it did happen. And so yeah, there are going to be abortifacients used in enslaved communities. You can, another thing was to grind up bluestone and to use it in a tea with other herbs and barks and plants and that kind of a thing. There are a couple old wives' tales about, basically like going inside of a log. But some of the techniques, of course, we actually do know are effective. And so things like the cotton root were really effective and helpful in allowing those women to reclaim ownership over their bodies in that way, especially for those who may have been victims of sexual assault, either by slaveholders or the slaveholding class, or I guess directly by them as perpetrators, or indirectly by them through forced breeding and reproduction. So yeah, definitely something that happens.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Colby asked a question that also I wanted to get to, and we're having some excellent questions from the audience. Really appreciate all of these. I definitely want to make sure we touch on this before we wrap up. He asked what kinds of treatments or care were used for formerly enslaved people at freedmen's colonies or contraband camps during the Civil War. And of course, us being the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, I definitely want to at least touch on this because I think, and now here I'm diverging a little bit from what Colby's original question here. I think these contraband camps are interesting places to look at medical care because some, not all, but some of the same dynamics are still in place in terms of medical care for enslaved folks, in plantations. There's still this kind of suspicion of white doctors, even though it's, maybe not as intensive an environment, shall we say, as, enslavement, but there's still some odd dynamics. So what would that look like?
Right. So, so the war itself creates, this pretty severe humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis, right? And so within the first 2 or 3 years of the war, you've got over 300 contraband camps with nearly 800,000 people in them, right? There are between 4 and 4.6 million enslaved people in the South by the time, or formerly enslaved people in the South by the time the war ends. And so if you think about it, that's a significant chunk of the Southern Black population that has now made its way into Union camps. And so one thing to consider, so some of the similarities, the dynamics, like preferring care from fellow members of enslaved communities, fellow refugees, looking to more herbal, more natural, less severe or harsh or harmful treatments. And really, another similarity being the advocacy, the self-advocacy, and trying to look out for themselves the best way that they could and to the best of their ability. Another constant was the racism that they experienced in the camps. They saw a lot of abuse from other people in the camps, but also if you think about just the number of people who seek refuge behind Union lines, the military wasn't prepared for those numbers or for those rations or supplies to be issued at that kind of a level. So we really see that in the camps, there are, if you are a Black person in these camps, you have a more than 3 times higher rate of catching a disease or falling ill than a white person in a Union camp. And you also have a death rate that is 2 to 3 times higher. You're much more likely to succumb to your wounds or your injuries than white soldiers or civilians that were in the camps. And so you're also going to see some constants like the lack of sanitation, the buildings themselves being less permanent, and of course having less privacy. The crowding in the camps is going to make it more difficult to have that privacy for care. But at the same time, they didn't have access to their typical resources, their gardens, local flora and fauna that they had knowledge of, or maybe had stored or come up with their own remedies and tinctures and things like that. And so without access, you have some struggles, obviously, and without resources to procure those treatments. So you're going to see in the camps, a lot of people arrive to the camps kind of destitute, almost naked, hungry, dealing with exposure. You're going to see 3 times the rate of death from disease among Blacks in the camps than you will whites. Nutrition is going to be an ongoing issue, exposure, things like that. But overall, we're going to see that about 20% of people who die in the camps are going to die from things like diarrhea, right? 14% from tuberculosis. And so there's going to be some pretty harsh environmental factors that are going to contribute to those things. You're going to have a lot of benevolent societies coming into the camps. By 1863, the Western Sanitary Commission observes that all the camps are full of hungry, sick people without proper clothing or shelter or supplies. And so you see some benevolent societies coming down to administer care. And then eventually the US Army is going to decide that that they will care for the contraband in the camps. But of course, in order for them to kind of rationalize or justify that, they have to put these people to work in the camps. And so they're laboring in exchange for, room and board, basically. But there were a lot of abuses that happened in that system. Eventually, you're going to get the establishment of the medical division of the Army. And then you're going to have the Freedmen's Bureau come along at the end of the war and take on healthcare for formerly enslaved people. And we're going to see that when they entered the camps, mortality rates for Black Southerners was roughly 30%. By the time the Freedmen's Bureau comes in after 1865, mortality has dropped to 13% amongst enslaved people. By 1867, that drops to just over 2%. So they actually continue to build hospitals to provide medical care because they see all this widespread suffering and this humanitarian crisis. But part of the problems is that those things are not continuously funded or supported. And a lot of those things are closed down right after the war. And so another issue that you have is a lack of Black practitioners that are being brought in. I think by the end of the war, there were 8 Black doctors in the US Medical Division. 7 of them were all based in the DC hospitals. And so you don't actually have a lot of Black providers or practitioners, which leads to a lot of mistrust, but also, a lack of, I guess, a disconnect between, the quality of care and that people were able to provide through the US military or the government versus the care that they may have wanted to provide. And so, yeah, we're going to see that roughly 38,000 of the 180,000 Black soldiers and sailors in the Civil War die of disease as well, which is also a rate much higher than their white counterparts, especially when you consider the fact that they were not allowed to be official service members for more than a year and a half of the war. So yeah, 35% higher mortality rates amongst Black people in the camps than white people. And that's going to have a lot of lasting impacts on health measures and metrics, but it's also going to affect health and medical care after the war ends, because you've taken, essentially, you've removed people from a system that wasn't necessarily a good system, where you have, enslaved people on a plantation trying to care for themselves, and then fighting for that control with doctors and slaveholders. But you essentially take them out of that situation, which is not a good situation, but then you put them in a situation where there's not an alternative, right? So you remove them from their resources and their typical practices and ability to care for themselves. And then you also take away the support that was being provided by the military or the government or slaveholding society. So at the end of the war, and especially after the war, we're going to see mortality rates for Black Americans, Black Southerners on the rise again, because because those things were abandoned due to, honestly, in many ways, due to belief that they weren't necessary. Some people believe that it wasn't their job or the government's job to care for members of society. And also there was a racial attitudes that people would become dependent on care and on charity and not care for themselves. And so essentially you kind of, pull the rug out from under, 4.5 million formerly enslaved people in the South, taking away what, not great system of healthcare they had, but not replacing it with anything. So although formerly enslaved communities are going to do their best to build their own hospitals and medical schools and establish their own, insurance programs and community support systems, of course, the metrics and measures for health and medical outcomes for Black Americans, particularly in the South, still lag behind white Americans. And a lot of that has to do with the long legacies of medicine and lack of healthcare, and also just historical devaluation of Black lives and Black bodies. So we see that mortality is much higher among Black individuals in camps, whether they're contraband refugees or service people. But we also see that the problems are going to be exacerbated after the war with those resources being taken away. So yeah, it's quite a lot of information to go through. There's a lot of different examples of care and types of care. There were, of course, people who did work really hard to make sure that they were looking after this more at-risk population. And so they did see a lot of success with government programs like the Freedmen's Bureau. They got Black mortality down to a little over 2% by 1867. White mortality was down to 1.2% at that time, but white mortality continued to go down while Black mortality then goes up once those resources are gone. So yeah, there's a lot happening at this time. And of course, medicine is changing. Standardization practices are changing. We're getting into germ theory soon. So it's a pretty fascinating topic. There's too many wheels in motion to talk about in just an hour. So sorry, I've taken up too much time.
Oh, it's all good. I mean, as you said, there are a lot of different avenues to go down when it comes to this topic. And it's one reason why I think Civil War medicine is endlessly fascinating, because it is so thoroughly simultaneously, it's both pre-modern and modern. It bridges the gap. It's all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
It lays this foundation that kind of leads us, or at least starts us on the path to modern medicine that we kind of know and benefit from today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over the course of our time here today, you've, I think, helped us paint a really pretty detailed portrait of at least a nice overview of the landscape of the medical experience of African Americans through at least the middle chunk of the 19th century. So thank you so much for helping us tackle that today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, or at least as best we can over the course of an hour. As you just mentioned, there's so much more to tackle on this subject, and I know there's a few questions we didn't get a chance to get to, but if we didn't get to your question, send us a message on Facebook, and we'll get to it as soon as we can offline and tackle it in that way. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. Really, really appreciate it. Follow us wherever you get your social medias to stay up to date with the museum: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We're all over the place. Actually, I think we might be getting a TikTok before too terribly long. So we're everywhere. So that's all exciting news. Easy, free way to support the museum. Like this video, share this video. That helps us out quite a bit. And if you want to take your support to the next level, consider donating to our latest fundraising campaign to get some letters written by Clara Barton to talk about her work searching for missing soldiers. Really, really important stuff for us to help preserve, and will let us continue telling incredible stories through the museum. So that's it from us today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you all next time.